Just Reading Club, episode 2. We're talking about The Wheel of Time again. Chapters 2 through 4. And then for the next episode, I think we're going to be talking about 5 through 7. Does that sound about right?
5 through 7.
I think so.
Let me check. Yeah. Sounds fine.
Yeah, because these chapters are also small. Chapter 5 is big, but 6 and 7 are also 10 pages each. 15 pages each, so that should be fine. So we left off last episode with Matt and Rand finishing up their tasks and whatever, and kind of talking about Egwene. And chapter 2 picks up right from that until there is the introduction of Perrin, right? No. I'm sorry. I'm getting this wrong.
No, not Perrin.
Right.
I think you mean Ewan.
Ewan, right. Ewan comes in first, and then he talks about having seen strangers in the village, and then he's talking about Matt and Rand think he's talking about the man in black, but he's actually talking about the newcomers to the village, which are these people that look like noblemen that are coming from a distant land. It's a woman who kind of looks young but has this authority of being older. And her guard, which is kind of like a knight from the stories the children think. And I think it's interesting. Eventually, they do a little bit of tomfoolery, and they end up meeting this dyad of people. Moiraine, the lady, who presents herself as kind of a historian, and Lamb, the knight. And I thought it was interesting. I wrote this down. We were talking about how maybe Jordan would have been impacted or influenced by his time in Vietnam, and I thought it was interesting that Lamb kind of is described as being a Vietnam knight, right? His clothes are dark grayish green. They would have faded into leaf or shadow. This is from page 52. And his cloak swirled through shades of gray and green and brown as it shifted in the wind. It almost seemed to disappear at times, that cloak, fading into whatever lay beyond it. His hair was long and gray at the temples, held back from his face by a narrow leather headband. So he looks like the kind of archetypal Vietnam soldier, right, with the camo cloak and military camo clothing and the headband. I thought the only thing that was missing from that classic character is like an M16 sword or something. So yeah, I don't know. I thought that was very, very noteworthy to me, because it's such an unusual description for a knight in a fantasy story. I can't see how...
And it is funny when you consider how Moiraine is described. She is described as having these, how do you say, fancy ornaments, light bluish cloak to convey that she might indeed be a woman from a higher hierarchy than what we are used to seeing from the Two River folks, right? It is funny to contrast how Moiraine is described to how Lan is described, because the guy is basically being described as a Vietnam soldier, and the woman is just a regular scholar.
It's very interesting how there's this kind of really weird disconnect of, like, she's a character from a fairy tale, and he's a character from Apocalypse Now.
Yeah. Basically.
It's quite funny. I like that. I think that's very interesting. And he goes on to characterize. He was doing this a little bit in the first chapter, where now I've started to see how the connections that people make to Lord of the Rings really blossom. where he's talking about how isolated the two rivers are from the rest of the world as the small village that never sees any real conflict. And then they're talking about like outsiders, this is from page 45, never come into the two rivers, or as good as never. And by the time that Moiraine and Lamb had come to visit, it had been 5 years since a real stranger had shown up in Eamon's Field. And now it really feels like it is a time of extreme change, because there's all these people coming. The Gleeman, the Man in Black, Moiraine, and Lamb, they're all converging in this town when, it had been half a decade before even one person from outside Eamon's Field even came to visit. And it's interesting to me, Moiraine's character is, because she does feel, we've been talking about in Dies Irae, I feel like we're going to be cross-referencing these two series a lot because they're very similar to each other in terms of theming and motifs. We were talking about archetypes over there, and Moiraine feels very archetypal to me as kind of like a cross between the maiden and the wise old woman, where she's clearly, a young woman and with beauty and lots of potential for change, and she doesn't treat like the kids of the village as being lesser than her, but she carries with herself this aura of age and knowledge, and she knows things about herbs and history, where the knowledge of history in a world like the Wheel of Time kind of is mystical because you're knowing about the past and the future at the same time. History is such a flexible, fluid thing.
She's like a historian of time.
Right.
A scholar of time. Sorry, historian of time. She seems redundant. Scholar of time. That's what I meant to say.
And she's this very neutral character that subverts the idea of the aristocrat, right? Because she comes in and she's a noblewoman, but she refuses to be referred to as a lady, and she freely hands gifts over to the kids. And at first she calls Nynaeve a child, but then she kind of, as soon as she knows that she's a wisdom and she doesn't like being referred to as a child, she changes her behavior that way. I think that's noteworthy. And it's interesting because it most certainly there's a magical component to her youth, because the boys, when they are talking about her, when they meet her in page 49, they're talking about how she looked as young as Nynaeve, which is most definitely impossible, considering Nynaeve is like 14 or something, right? Like she's still a child. And it's almost like a spell that's been put on her to preserve that youthfulness, because the longer he looks, like the illusion kind of shatters, and he starts to see those marks of age in wisdom, invoking that wise old woman archetype, right? The connection between age and knowledge. And I thought that was like an interesting way of describing her, where it's so mercurial that even the reader doesn't really know how to imagine her. And there's this interesting cultural thing of her being older, her being a mature woman, but not wearing her hair braided, which is curious, because in the Two Rivers culture, it's like an unseen thing. When a woman is old enough, she braids her hair, and it's a status symbol. So that could either mean that Moiraine doesn't care about status at all, which is in keeping with her character, or that from wherever she is, that isn't a part of the culture, and it adds to the mystery of the character, which is even doubled down when they talk about her wearing a ring in the shape of the Great Serpent. This is also on page 49, which is an ancient symbol of the Wheel of Time, being the Ouroboros, right? The serpent that eats its own tail.
Actually, it's described as being an older symbol than the Wheel of Time itself.
Right.
So there's that, right?
So it almost feels like she's been taken from a different age and time entirely. and she's been like transposed here. And it makes me wonder what exactly her role is, because she doesn't disclose to whom she's working for, right? And it feels auspicious that she's showing up in a time of conflict like this, which we eventually do find out it is a time of conflict, as what is his name? Padain Fane eventually shows up, the peddler, and starts telling stories about the world outside being put in danger by a dragon reborn, or a claimant to that title.
Right, and then we learn about the dragons reborn, right? All the false dragons, and that bit of world building about these great figures who claimed to be the dragon, because apparently there is this prophecy that the dragon will return as some sort of savior for humanity. Right. I don't remember the details, but it is interesting that he brings up this thing that actually happened many times in history. I can think like of Commodus from the old Roman Empire,
right,
who conveyed his image as being the reincarnation of Hercules, I think, right?
Right, I think so.
Yeah, and then it's interesting, this parallel, because through Rand, we learned that these dragons reborn were all fakes, and were all figures who brought destruction in their paths.
Right.
To the people who followed them, and to his enemies, everyone, basically. I think it's really cool concept that the author brought.
And I'll get to discussing that a little bit as soon as I make a couple of observations in terms of imagery. At the beginning of chapter 3, at the very header, there's like a little illustration of this comma-shaped like Magatama thing, which looks like one half of the Taijitu, right, the yin-yang circle, which is a symbol that got mentioned in the prologue in association with Lews Therin. So I wonder what the symbolism here implies of how is this symbol in connection to the prologue connected to the characters now. Maybe it has to do with this dragon figure, which does have this kind of dual savior as well as corrupted character to it, which again is going to be interesting when we bring the archetype conversation back. But then also we got introduced to Perrin before they start talking about the dragon stuff. And Perrin is kind of an interesting character because he's a very clear mythological illusion. He's very stocky and strong, but also very straightforward. And his name evokes Perun, which is the Slavic deity of the sky, thunder, lightning, law, fertility, and oak trees, who is associated with a hammer, kind of like his Norse equivalent Thor. They're kind of the same archetype, as well as with an axe and an arrow. And I think it's an interesting thing that Perrin is associated with this god because he is related to a blacksmith, right, whose kind of signature tool is the hammer. So there's definitely kind of a little bit of illusion here between Perrin and his mythological kind of forefathers, Perun and Thor. And it's curious that he gets introduced here because he's also seen the Man in Black. And he kind of helps strengthen the boys' theories about, you know, this figure being real and being a real threat. And he also mediates kind of like the childish kind of like innocence of Rand versus the trickstery kind of excitement of Matt that feels kind of sinister at times when he expresses kind of like this fascination with the tragedies going on in the outside world. Perrin is kind of very steadfast and well behaved.
Yeah, I think this is a glow up in these chapters how the character relationships are built. We get to explore more of that since the beginning of chapter 2 with Matt and Rand and Ewing, how they interact with each other, how Matt is a reckless fool, basically, as you described him. There is all this tragedy happening around the world, and the guy is just excited about
Right.
war,
About a thing
destruction
going
before
on.
dying.
And it really sends to me that kind of idea of the archetypal trickster, right? As a figure that kind of is incomprehensible because he's driven by what normal people, quote unquote, repress. The shadow is kind of what moves the trickster along. He's interested in seeing conflict arise and in generating conflict because those are the things that to him are important, and he doesn't care that normal people in a normal society should repress those things and hide them. He's just in touch with that. And I feel like that's also crucial to the figure of the dragon, because the dragon is at the same time a savior figure that heals, but he's also wounded by a loss of sanity, right? Ewan mentions in page 60 that by the end of a dragon's time, he goes mad and dies, right? And he wounds other people in the process of gaining and channeling that power and losing his sanity. So he kind of perfectly fits the trickster figure of being the wounded wounder who heals. He brings healing to the world while also causing destruction and self-harm. And I feel like they're trying to sell Matt as being that kind of character who doesn't care that the great exciting events are causing much suffering and dread. He just wants to be in there because it's exciting and new and different. Kind of reminds me of Shido also from the Aesidae a little bit in that sense. But it also explains, I think, this whole elaboration, what happened with Lews Therin, where he saw himself as being an agent of good, but then he lost his mind and caused all this tragedy and evoked that same power that they mentioned, that this current dragon apparently can also wield, that opens the ground beneath the enemy's feet and crumbles walls and invokes lightning, all things that Lews Therin did in the prologue. So there's that question in the background: is this dragon really fake? What makes a fake dragon? Is the channeling of the power sufficient to demonstrate truth, or is there does he need to conform to that myth of being both a messianic and a demoniac figure?
Speaking of power, we have this drop about the dragons trying to harness the so-called one power.
Right.
What is this one power? I mean, we were introduced to a bunch of concepts,
right,
in just less than 100 pages, and now we got a new one, the one power. Just what is this thing?
Well, I feel like the one power isn't a new concept, because he was talking about in the prologue how Lews Therin was tapping into the male power, and the Betrayer of Hope accuses him, and when he's accusing him, he mentions how his sisters were tapping into a different power, presumably female, which is kind of like strengthened by this line that Ewan says, he'll go mad and die in page 60. In the stories, men who channel the power always go mad. They waste away and die. Only women can touch it. So I think this is the same power that they were talking about in the prologue, where there's the women that employ a good, kind of harmless, pure healing form of this magic that they draw from the world, whereas men, even if they have good intentions, are bound to corrupt when they draw that same power.
Yeah, probably. The line you read was was it from chapter 4?
It was from chapter 3. It's in page 60.
Oh, right. It was when the peddler was talking, right?
Right, when the peddler was...
And then the wisdom replied with that, right?
Right. And then there's all this talk. They're also kind of introducing this new faction, the Aes Sedai, right? Who, in traditional mythology, are reckoned to be the only people capable of defeating the dragon. But curiously, there's all these paradoxes that I think are very interesting. While the dragon, some people, right, see the dragon, and this is from page 63, as actually being a messiah who will come in the hour of mankind's greatest need to save them all. His coming causes the world to be torn asunder. And the Aes Sedai, who some stories claim to be dark friends, right, servants of Shaitan, are the only people that are able to stop the dragon, but in doing so, before they broke the world, right, which they mention in page 63. So it seems that all of these cosmic forces, kind of like the symbol of the yin-yang thing, right, they're all comprised of a good and an evil aspect, where they cause healing and destruction at the same time. And that seems to be kind of a recurring theme in the world building.
Yeah, that and the fragmentation of the gender, right? The male power and the female power.
Right.
Very representative of the yin yang.
Right. And as soon as all of that is done, the boys are talking to each other and sharing theories. And there's kind of this return to the old occult thing of the true name. The name dropping a powerful entity invokes it, right? We were talking about this last episode, and it seems like this is even more true because Nynaeve kind of busts into the group when they're talking about name dropping Shaitan, and she's like, you shouldn't fucking do that because you're inviting his presence. You're going to cause misfortune. And Nynaeve is a fucking lovely character. I am a big fan of Nynaeve. She reminds me very strongly of Reen from Fate Stay Night, with the amount of tune she has, and also like that kind of thing of hers being, you know, this child invested with a huge responsibility and power, and her kind of struggling to act on that power precisely because she's a child and she has to put on this adult role and she's not super prepared for it. And she's followed by Egwene, who Nynaeve claims has latent power to listen to the wind, as Nynaeve does, which becomes a cause of conflict, right? Rand is into Egwene. Egwene is kind of like, we don't know if she's into him or if she's into anybody at all. She seems to be kind of like trying to like Nynaeve, be more mature and think about herself and the future, right? In a way that I think would have been relatable to people in Jordan's time when women were becoming, you know, a bigger part of society and kind of integrating into the market for the first time, and leaving behind the traditional gender role of making a family with a man to pursue a career, which is kind of what I think Egwene's thing here of like, yeah, I have power to become a wisdom. I want to be important. I want to act on that power. I want to be of help to people. And so I will very likely give up this attribute of traditional femininity that is marriage. Right? Rand kind of notes in page 67 that a wisdom almost never marries. And Egwene says that Nynaeve has been teaching her, and she's so enamored with this responsibility, this new mission that she's found, that she's okay with giving up that marriage. Of course, Rand isn't okay with that because he's selfish. He's a kid. He wants to be with the girl he loves, and he knows that if she's allowed to pursue that dream, he's not gonna be able to fulfill his. And it's conflictuous because he wants to see her happy, but he also wants to be on top, you know. So I think this is probably going to be a recurring issue later in the book, and probably part of like the greater arc of Rand growing out of his status as a child. If we were talking about archetypes again, growing out of being a child to being a hero to being a man, it's probably going to be in part the process of coming to terms with that thing that the person he's interested in has different objectives than he does.
Right. You learn to let go of everything he fears to lose.
Right. And letting go of possessiveness, right? Which I think would
Right.
Go in hand with the kind of Taoist, Buddhist aesthetics that the book is kind of evoking, where you need to allow yourself to give up the attachment, right? And to understand that, you know, things happen regardless of you. I think that's all pretty interesting.
Yeah, I think we get glimpses of that right at the prologue, because if I'm not mistaken, the I forgot his name already. Who was it? The one who's not Luz Theron?
The Betrayer of Hope.
Yes, the Betrayer of Hope. Yes, I think he offered him a chance to get everything he had lost through the service of the Dark One, right?
Right.
If I'm not mistaken. Yeah, but he just rightfully refuses, even though it will bring him pain, even though he will have to face the pain of what he has done. He just refuses and chooses to do the right thing.
Right. And yeah, I think that's a big part of it. Both, I'm figuring that this is also one of the major themes alongside the question of gender roles changing with time, and then us having to be okay with that in our process of maturing and letting people other than us take their own decisions for their happiness. And I think part of that also comes back in chapter 4 when they introduce the Gleeman. In Lord of the Rings, right, the Gleeman equivalent is Gandalf. And Gandalf is the wise old man, right? He's this old figure from far away that in his ancientness represents all of this knowledge, both common and hidden. And he guides the hero with his knowledge, and he's kind of an upstanding guy. You know, he's kind of the icon of upstandingness. He's the reference. Whereas here, the role of the wise old man is taken by Moiraine, and the traditional wise old man, the Gleeman, is kind of a fucking asshole, right? Like, he makes all these weird sexist remarks at Nynaeve, and which is really creepy because she's a child, and he's talking about how pretty she is and whatever.
Yeah, he does the same to Egwene.
And Egwene, right? And he's like doing all of these things that are supposed to be kind of wonderful, right? Like to bring joy to people, but he has this expression of bitterness that he doesn't really want to do all these things, and he just feels kind of like cynical and tired. And even though he does know all of these stories, the fact that he's so overbearing and callous kind of takes away any of the mystery and the joy of learning about them. And it just makes all of the situation feel very awkward. Which I think is part of that subversion of those traditional roles, in lieu of giving a little bit more weight to the personal moral character of people, as opposed to them just following what society expects them to. But the Gleeman ends up spilling some additional beans about history, and he talks about how he doesn't want to know anything about the Aes Sedai because they're too much trouble, and he doesn't want to make any opinions about the war. Almost opposite, right? Diametric opposite to Gandalf. He doesn't want to opine on any of this because it's too much trouble. He just wants to make his money. And having strong moral convictions about anything is a quick way to not be a successful businessman. It's kind of a very cynical take on all of it. But eventually we find out that he has all these stories of the past and the future, and he mentions Arthur, the High King, which is a great King Arthur reference.
Right. Actually, because the guy is called Arthur
Pendrag.
I
right.
don't have Pendrag.
And in another moment, it also is interesting that he kind of there's a little bit of maybe critique at literary snobs. I think this would have been the time to do it, where like originally, in our time, a lot of literary snobs looked at genre fiction, like fantasy, especially the stuff of Tolkien, as being like, oh, this is childish and stupid, and there's not like any of the conventions that make great stories. And the Gleeman makes a similar observation towards Egwene's favorite stories, where they're like, oh, the stories that people want to hear are the epic journeys and the transformations and the all of the mythological stuff. These stupid short stories about about comedy or women outsmarting men through wit are old, and they're out of fashion, and it kind of feels like she's shamed for liking these. And I think that's kind of that maybe that's pointing toward that kind of antiquated, annoying literary snob position of like, classical fiction is all that exists. Genre fiction is garbage. Should feel bad for liking it.
Yeah, especially us guys who read visual novels and make podcasts about
right
fantasy books.
And eventually, we get to the ending of chapter 4 with kind of what I think is the ultimate setup, where it's very clear that the council is keeping some shit secret, right? Like, they're organizing the scouting party to go up north along the rivers to they say that the reason that they're doing this is to find evidence of nothing, to try to calm the people down, because they know that if they don't do anything, people are going to be hysterical and everything is going to go off the rails and explode. But I feel like for a tiny village to create such an expedition that's going to send a bunch of men far away to find nothing, I think that's a weak. I think that's an excuse. I think that just like how Bran, the mayor, last episode at the end of the first chapter was talking about having been told something by Nynaeve that he agrees with, that he doesn't elaborate. Maybe this time in their conversation with Pat and Fane, they were told things that confirm those fears that they're trying to keep hidden from the people. And they're mounting this expedition to go find evidence of those fears instead. Or else, it wouldn't be... I don't think it would be worth it to put on such an expensive endeavor. And of course, Matt wants to join them because he wants to see the chaos unraveling, right? He wants to be part of it. He wants to break free from the malaise of the daily life in the village. He wants to have a purpose. And eventually they all have a conversation with Tam, who's part of the expedition. And Rand is talking about seeing the black man, and he's expecting to find him in this expedition. And Tam confirms that he probably is real. But there's this catch that only young men seem to see the Black Rider. And this is said between pages 87, rather, 86 and 87, where he's talking about all of the boys have seen this guy, the young boys. And it's curious that it's not the young girls, right? So maybe this Black Rider, this is my crackpot theory, is kind of like a representation of the male, the Sidene, right? The male half of the One Power. And he might be showing himself to these boys, kind of like how in Fate's Day Night, like, Magi hear the call of the Grail. Like maybe he's presenting himself as kind of like this this process of selection, that maybe one of them is going to end up having powers similar to that of a dragon.
Probably Matt, considering how much the writer wants us to see that all of this is exciting to him.
Right. Matt does seem like he fits the general archetype of that character. But I wonder if this is like a red herring, you know? Like maybe he's like putting all this focus on Matt to make us think that he's the one that's being selected here. But then that'll be subverted later. I don't know how straight Robert is going to play this whole trope. But I do like, overall, I did like these 3 chapters more than I like the first chapter. I think their pacing is a little bit better. I like that they're all short and to the point, and they get to the thematic exploration and the setting up of future plot events pretty quickly without wasting much time.
Yeah, we get a lot of world building and character establishment here, especially with Moraine and Rand, I'd say, in general.
I'm very curious to see how Moiraine fits into all of this, because I'm not entirely convinced by her presentation of herself as a historian. I think she's here for a different reason. I don't think it's a coincidence.
Is, right?
Of course. I don't think it's a coincidence that she's here the same time that the kids are starting to see the Black Rider.
I'm more intrigued by what she says about the Two Rivers having some historical significance, even though no one who actually lives there knows anything about it.
Right. I thought that was a curious quote. Let me see if I can find it. I marked it and I didn't mention it when we were talking about that chapter, but she talks about how places change names. There you go. Here's the quotation. As the wheel of time turns, Moiraine said, this is on page 51, half to herself, and with a distant look in her eyes, places wear many names. Men wear many names, many faces, different faces, but always the same man. Yet no one knows the great pattern the wheel weaves, or even the pattern of an age. We can only watch and study and hope. And this quote, this line, in addition to her kind of presentation of herself as a historian, and we know that a student of history in the Wheel of Time is part historian, part prophet, right? Because of the cyclical nature. I can't help but think that she's here to investigate maybe this phenomenon with the boys, especially because she is drawn to them, and she gives them these coins in exchange for a job that isn't very clear. Like she's keeping she's marking them, right? She's gonna come back to them.
Yeah, she seems interested in knowing who's who lives where, which. Yeah, she seems interested in those kind of ordinary things,
right,
about the townspeople. It seems off, unless she's looking for something.
I do think that it's purposeful that she mentioned this thing about men wearing many names and faces, different faces, but always the same man. I suspect that she's in this village looking for someone that fits a certain pattern, right? She's looking for the new furniture of an archetype that
looking
she
for Mercurius.
Mercurius, right? And maybe that's why she's here. She's here because she knows that in the hero's journey of the Wheel of Time, this is a place where she can find that Atman, that character that she's looking for. Because it does seem like a new story's beginning, right? A new age.
One thing that I do not know if it is relevant is that when the Gleeman is introduced, we get to the author focus our attention to the fact that he has blue eyes,
right?
And that those stand in contrast to the ordinary folks from the Two Rivers who have mostly dark eyes. And then Rand comments about how he himself has been focused of this unwanted attention because of the fact that he has gray eyes.
Right,
and the Gleeman and the Gleeman himself comments on the fact about how he's taller than the average Edmund's Field
villager, right?
Yeah, villager.
And I think that's true. It's awkward because they're talking about the people from this area of the world, Nynaeve and Egwene and stuff. They're mentioned as having like dark hair and dark eyes and kind of a dark skin. In stark contrast to Rand, who is this pale redhead with gray eyes, and he got all of this from his mother that we know nothing about. Right? Again, it feels like Tam is hiding his mother's identity. And it starts begging the questions of like, why did that woman come to this isolated place? How did Tam meet her? Like, is this part of like a greater scheme? Because it does feel weird that Rand is so different.
If Tam is his father at all, right?
Right.
As far as we know. He could have just adopted him because in the first descriptions we get from Rand, he doesn't look very much like his father. The author comments that most of his traits come from his mother,
right?
Which was told by him by his father. So it could have all be lies.
Right, exactly. And they live in isolation from the village, so there isn't anybody that can corroborate these facts, right? And if they are probably in the council that looks like it's keeping all these secrets from the people with the intention of preventing kind of a scandal. So I definitely think that there's a lot of interesting stuff going on. I'm expecting the next few chapters to kind of kick off the story now that we have what seems to be all the major players on stage. I don't think that this expedition is going to go well. There's too much.
I wonder. Sorry, can finish
sure.
your thought? No. Please finish first.
No, yeah, I was just going to say that there's too much going poorly with this festival. There's too many omens for something bad not to happen, if not in the expedition, on the way back from the expedition.
Yeah, what I was gonna say is I wonder if we'll get to see the prologue repeating itself in the story.
Right.
Because I wonder if we get to meet, or if we have already met, some sort of loose starring of the current age, and then the events of the prologue repeat themselves in the story at some point. It would be fitting.
I would be very surprised if that didn't happen, right?
Yeah.
I feel like it's going to eventually take us there where because of the repetition of the cyclical nature of the wheel of time, we are bound to come back to that moment where one of the characters that we're following is responsible for a great tragedy, and he's in the throes of having lost his mind, right?
Right.
But the greatest question for me, that I don't think we're going to get an answer to anytime soon, is to what extent is this story that's unfolding in the novel, in the series, going to be just another turn of the wheel? Or is this going to be perhaps a little bit like Dies Irae, where this is a story that aims to break the cycle of the wheel and ends up having like these huge offshoot seismic effects on history, right?
Right. Kind of like Star Wars, right?
Right.
In which everything was cyclical up until the point in which Anakin was born, and then his son broke actually, Anakin broke the cycle that was repeating itself over and over.
Right. I do think that there's space for doing that, and I think it would be an interesting thing, but I don't know at which point. I think this is also part of the great mystery of it, is like, at which point is it going to stop being cyclical? How long, for the duration of the saga, are we going to play it straight, and then when is it going to break if it does? But yeah,
I mean, there are 12 books,
right.
so
I am curious to see where it goes. I'm very very excited about this story. It's been a while since I've read a book like this that like instantly captured me, even though it's such a traditional beginning for a story. I'm having a fun time with it.
right. One final comment I have is about how the author deals with townsfolk people knowing about war, getting to experience war.
Right.
Because, they were in this isolated village, and then this cataclysm, I don't know how to pronounce that word, but those big events happen, and then they just happen to know about it from merchants, peddlers.
Right.
And now the world has turned upside down. I think he's drawing from his own experience there, right? From Vietnam.
I would think so. And I also thought that was noteworthy when they're talking about the merchants, the peddlers. They mention how they bring goods, but people don't go to the market for buying trinkets. They go to the market to get information from the outside world, right? And it's this kind of dichotomy of like, we like being isolated because nothing bad ever happens in this place that we live. But at the same time, it feels so restrictive, and we need to know what's going on outside. Perhaps in that kind of like echo of what we were talking about in the Dies Irae episode, of people wanting to be free from mundanity. And even just knowing that there's stuff going on outside brings that excitement and that fear that's so missing from a peaceful life in the village.
Yeah, you can see that having a greater effect on the kids of the village. Yeah, both Matt and Egwene showed what you're talking about, right? That interest in fantasy, in those epics of history.
Right.
All of those fantastical stories that break from mundane events.
Yeah, that's my impression. It's definitely a play on that, but on a little bit of a wider scale. That I think is very relatable if you've ever lived in a tiny village or a rural town, that's so distant from the rest of the world.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if Edmund's Clifffield was destroyed at some point, because it would then break the shelter in which Rand actually resides in.
Right.
It would force him out of his shell, as if the village represents innocence, represents comfort, and it's all taken by war.
Right. Exactly. I think that's a solid theory. And just to piggyback off of this, for my final observation, I think that it's very interesting how uh, Jordan in the Wheel of Time doesn't only take from Eastern symbols and ideas when he's writing these themes. I think it's quite interesting how it feels like an Eastern story in a kind of in a way. The Wheel of Time, more so than most Western fantasy that I've read, reminds me a lot of anime. From the kind of mundane village setting where the only thing that there is like these tiny petty squabbles and all of the shit talking other people behind their back and this desire for information from outside, as well as the main character having a distinctive eye and hair color to all of the other normals.
Right. It's funny. It's funny you tackle on that because all the time you were bringing that up, I could only think about the narrative from The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time,
Right.
which incredibly fits the situation we're in the book. The protagonist is off from everyone else around him. He lives in this isolated place, which is comfortable and could stand for his innocence. And then greater events outside of this world start to affect this place, and he is forced out of his shell. You know.
Right. I think that's definitely true to an extent. And it, a couple months ago, I had gotten into this mood where I was watching a lot of slice of life anime, and a lot of slice of life anime is about this, where there's all these rural areas in Japan that are entirely isolated from the rest of the country, and the country's already so isolated from the rest of the world where it just feels like everybody has their rote lives put in place, and it's never going to deviate from that because it's just such a boring little place. And it's a recurring theme in a lot of Japanese fantasy and fiction, from Non Non Biori to Fate Stay Night to Final Fantasy. The Final Fantasy plots almost always involve a little bit of this kind of like contrast between the small village setting and the kids wanting more, and then the eventuality of a big thing coming that is transformative, right? It brings to them character growth and self-discovery, but always hand to hand with tragedy, right? Wherein I don't know. I don't want to spoil Final Fantasy VII, but that's kind of like one of the big things about Final Fantasy VII. And Fate Stay Night is also, in large part, kind of about this.
If only Matt watched Evangelion.
So true. I do think that this is like, it's uncanny how many similarities there are to Fate Stay Night with some of the characters. Especially like the main character being a redhead with bright eyes and tall and having this bow that he carries around. And the Nynaeve being the young mage, tsundere with all this responsibility and those issues, those problems. And then Matt kind of being resembling of Shinji, even though Shinji is kind of a more negative take on the trickster, where there's still the character traits, but he's seen from a more cynical angle, a more realistic angle, less mythological. And it makes me wonder if Nasu read The Wheel of Time, because by the time that Fate Stay Night had come out, I think the first 4 books of The Wheel of Time had already been translated and published, or the first 10 books-ish, something like that, to Japanese. No, the first 6 books had been translated by by 2004. By 2000, it was the first 3-ish books. So I wouldn't be surprised if Nasu had come across this.
We have to look and when he started writing it, right? Because he started writing it in college, if I'm not mistaken.
Right, but then I know for a fact, they did a weird thing with the publication of The Wheel of Time in Japan, where they broke each book down into light novels. So, like, there's 60 Wheel of Time books in Japan that are about, like, 100 pages long. They also have
Wait,
fucking
wait.
banger art, cover art. But
Ooh, there's cover art.
yeah, it's beautiful, phenomenal. I think it's by the Castlevania artist, or it's very evocative of Castlevania art.
The Symphony of the Night one?
Yeah, it reminds me of a little
Holy
bit of that
shit.
mixed with Yoshitaka Amano's concept art for Final Fantasy. It's very very beautiful and evocative. But I believe that the first novel, the 3 or 4 parts of it, had been published at some point by 1990. Let me see. Yeah, the final part, the 5th part of the first novel, had been published by 1998. At which point I think Nasu would still be in college. If he started college in 1996 and published Tsukihime in 2000, then I think there would have been time for him to come across at least the first novel of The Wheel of Time, if not both, because the second one had already been published by 1999. So I wouldn't be surprised if Nasu had read this at some point during the production of Fate Night. I'd be very surprised if he hadn't, considering all these connections. But anyway, that's a cool, interesting little trivia. But yeah, other than this, do you have anything else to say? Or
No. I thought those three chapters were fine. Definitely an improvement. And as you already said, I think the pacing started to pick up.
right?
And I hope it keeps improving from here on.
Yeah, me too. I'm excited to see what comes next. To close it all off, what comes next is going to be 5 through 7. And I think we're going to try to stick to the 3 chapters every 2 weeks format. I think that's a healthy pace to balance with real life stuff. And hopefully
Yeah,
we'll have that out soon.
Considering there are like 53 chapters, I think it's healthy.
Right, and yeah, I hope that we'll be able to record again soon. So yeah, episode over.